Henry Ford said, you catch things on the rising tide, you're doomed to success.
This is the Culture Closeup for The Lady and the Dale, and my name is Chase Strangio. I am Deputy Director for Transgender Justice at the ACLU, and I am so happy to be here in conversation with Zackary Drucker and Precious Brady-Davis. Who is Liz Carmichael?
Elizabeth Carmichael was an entrepreneur in the 1970s who sold options on an energy-efficient three-wheeled car called the Dale. Liz stormed the media in a few short months and was ultimately exposed and revealed to be a transgender woman who was a felon who had been on the run. She is this incredibly complicated, flawed protagonist. Being a part of rectifying that maligned representation of her from the 70s was an incredible learning experience.
What are some of the themes and connections that were most salient to you and drew you to her?
We see her daughter, Candy Michael. She refers to Liz as her mommy. I like seeing another trans woman being a mother.
I'm curious, what your experience was like drawing forth this story with the people who really loved her and then the people who seemingly were obsessed with exposing her.
One of the curious things was that everybody effortlessly described Liz as a woman. They used she, her pronouns until they were asked about her trans identity, which was typically at the end of the interview, at which point they would usually kind of like riff and talk a little bit about their views on trans people. And that was always an uncomfortable moment. And I heard people say things that I don't think they would have said if they were aware that there was a trans person in the room.
And this, I think, is just such an important point because so much of how we've organized society in terms of sex separation for, so long, we've just sort of recognized that, say, there's a sign on the women's bathroom door for women and a sign on the men's bathroom door for men. And, actually how we manage the entry point into the restroom or into the sports team is through self-determination. There's not someone standing at the bathroom door sort of scanning your genitals or your chromosomes. What ends up happening in the last 10 years, however, is when trans people become a part of the discourse, then we have like this overlay of weaponization onto these ideas. Things that actually have been sort of accepted as part of self-determination. All of a sudden, when we sort of put trans people in the center of a conversation, you start to see how much dehumanization happens, which I think also relates to this question that maybe all three of us think about a lot, which is what happens when you insert a trans person into a space that is, had previously been full of cis people talking about trans people or talking about transness. And so my experience is very much, that yes, as a trans person entering, say, the state capitol or the federal courtroom where people are sort of contending with transness in this deeply violent ways is excruciating on the one hand, but then on the other hand, when you're openly trans in those spaces, they're having to say these arguments to your face. And that sort of disrupts, ever so slightly at least, the nature of the discourse. And so just inserting trans people into the storytelling, you can see how differently the conversations end up having to play out.
You see the way that they speak to Liz's body, the way that they dehumanize her womanhood based on her presentation. She's revolutionary in the way that she presents herself, the way that she navigates the supermarket. And it particularly struck me the way that even in death, that there still is this dehumanization. And it's one of the things that I love so much about this story, that she is not your typical, what we've come to know, depiction of a trans woman. And I think that expands our narrative of transness, that this is something new, that this is a new phenomenon. I like that it adds to that. We've always been here, a part of the fabric of culture, society, and that trans people, that we're not just a monolith.
I think the notion that Liz was a man masquerading as a woman to commit fraud was so persistent that it outlived her. You know, in their minds, Liz really wasn't trans. It was just another scheme. The legacy of Liz's outing in the media is very much, I think, the bedrock of where we are today. And it doesn't fly in the same way because we are out, we are visible, we are leaders in our communities. The progress that we've made is staggering, and so too is the opposition to our rights.
I think it's such an important part of the series. I think some people might be like, why did you leave, that transphobia in there? But I think it is an actual depiction of what trans folks go through every day.
So I actually really think the way that the anti-transness of Liz's experience, and then even in the contemporary moment in the interviews, is really sort of essential to understanding the trans present, is sort of the lineage of anti-transness. Liz is there in the 70s being asked, why should you go to a woman's prison? And she's like, because I'm a woman. And this idea that transness is new, and people have been asserting their truth forever, and sort of seeing the sort of self-assuredness of her presence, feels like a really important part of trans history, especially when you sort of impose the narrative that she is inherently a fraud on top of it. And that is completely exactly the narrative we're dealing with today, right? I do think sort of just taking this story, you are able to excavate so much about the world that we have lived in and the world that we currently live in. Ultimately, you come away from the docuseries and, with this sense of, wow, like we do have this long, rich history, and it may be messy and it may be nonlinear, but that's what makes it so perfect.
And we give Liz some dignity.
Yes.
The lady and the Dell.
Yes.
Like we speak her name. And it's one of the things that I love about the queer community so much, that we believe in this iconography, so that we are not forgotten. And that's what I love about the Dale so much.
I feel liberated by Liz's messiness in a lot of ways. It makes me feel like, okay, I can be flawed, I can make mistakes, I can be a full human being in this life. Trans and non-binary people represent the future. We are manifesting fully actualized selves.
Well, thank you both, because I think Precious and Zackary, you have just been, giving us gifts all the time, creating so much in this world, and this project is part of that. So I love The Lady in the Dale. I love being in conversation with you both to hear more about what it meant to you both and where we go from here.
Thank you so much for being part of this conversation.
Thank you, Chase. Thank you, Precious.
Love you guys.